Hey everybody, good evening. Welcome to our webinar, Connecting Kids with Christ. My name is Steve Christoforou. Just a little bit of background on me for those who don't know me. I'm the director of Y2AM, which is the Department of Youth and Young Adult Ministries in the Office of Camping Ministries of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. I'm a graduate of Yale University, Fordham University School of Law. After 2 years working at a Wall Street firm, I began my studies at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. And right after receiving my MDiv in the spring of 2013, I started working with what would eventually become Y2AM, and I've been here ever since. And it's great to be with all of you this evening. Thanks for taking the time. So here's kind of a quick look ahead to what we'll be doing. We're going to break down the webinar into three basic components. So first, we're going to take a look at this concept of staying connected, which is frequently the goal of our ministry efforts. And I think we need to push back on it a bit so we can clarify our focus. Second, we'll look at Be the Bee, the video series, through the lens of this clarified ministry focus, so we can identify what exactly it does, what role it plays and can play in our ministry efforts. Finally, we'll take a look ahead and work through some ways we can make better use of Be the Bee as a ministry tool, but also just kind of general thoughts about how to approach youth ministry, catechesis, religious education, that kind of good stuff. And after that, we'll have some time for questions and answers, which is available through the chat that I think a bunch of people have already begun to use. You should be able to see the Q&A button on your screen. You can click and submit some questions. I'm going to ask that we all hold off on that until we're done, so I can try to get through all of the material. There's a lot. We're not going to get through everything. I apologize if I move over things a little bit quickly, but that's hopefully what the Q&A is going to be for at the end. And you can always reach out by email if we run out of time or whatever it is. And before we get started, I just want to be clear that my goal here isn't to give you tips or tricks as such. No youth ministry hacks or magic tricks to help you revolutionize your classroom or youth group. Instead, my goal is to challenge you to really think about how you approach ministry and religious education and what your goals are. To challenge you to examine the framework in which you're working and see whether, in light of the gospel and our contemporary understanding of contemporary culture, that all makes sense. So let's try. First, let's think about this issue of staying connected. For many of us, maybe for all of us, this is a big objective behind our youth and young adult ministry work. We see the numbers, we see Pew Research, which indicates that religious affiliation across the country is dropping. We see a decline in baptism and chrismation figures across the Archdiocese. Maybe we even see declining stewardship in our parishes and declining participation in Sunday school and Goya and other ministry programs. I think that's probably a familiar story to a lot of us, if not all of us. It's easy to fall into a deep, unsettling fear that we're losing our kids, that we're failing our kids, that we've got to do something to stop the bleeding. Against this backdrop, I want to bring your attention back to this past Sunday's gospel reading. It was the first Sunday of Luke, and the reading was from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, which is available online. And you've heard it before, and I'd encourage you to go back and read it again. You know the story. Christ encounters his future disciples after a night of unsuccessful fishing. Tired, and even worse, they have nothing to show for it. Their boats are completely empty. And yet Christ tells the unlucky fishermen to get back to work. He tells them to put out into the deep and let down their nets for a catch. Peter objects that they've been fishing all night, fruitlessly. And yet, after verbalizing this objection, he agrees. At your word, I will let down the nets. And of course, the fishermen are shocked to find, that not only do they catch fish, they end up catching so many that their nets literally begin to break. They end up catching so many fish that they need help hauling them into the boat. And that's when Christ offers the biggest surprise of all. He tells them, I'm not here to simply help you catch fish. I'm here to make you fishers of men. And perhaps one of the biggest challenges of this entire passage is that it comes with what I take to be, anyway, an implicit promise. No, Christ does not promise us wealth or comfort or even happiness. There is no prosperity gospel. But he does seem to promise us full nets. He does seem to promise that if we let down our nets at his word, we will have a bigger catch than we can handle. And I don't mean fish, because as he said, Christ makes us fishers of men. From the very beginning, the church has reaped the fruits of this promise. On Pentecost, Peter preached to the crowds, and 3,000 people were added to the church. For centuries, we have preached Christ crucified and resurrected, and people have responded. Regardless of historical time period, regardless of culture, people have responded to the gospel by uniting themselves to Christ. And yet, our experience stands in striking contrast to that, doesn't it? Here we are in 2016. As a church, we've been in the United States for over a century, as well as other places around the world for decades, if not at least a century. And yet we remain, at best, in many of these places of the diaspora, a teeny tiny sliver of the population. Our nets are empty. Our youth are falling away from the church in great numbers. And so here we are, trying to figure out what to do next. Trying to figure out how to connect our kids, how to engage our kids, how to not lose our kids. Because that's what we're really afraid of at the end of the day, isn't it? We're afraid of losing our kids. We're afraid that they'll leave the safe spaces we've created for them at home and at youth group, that they'll get mixed up with the wrong crowd and start drinking or doing drugs or having sex or whatever the case may be. We're afraid that they're going to leave home and get swept away by bad choices. So we want them here now in our youth groups and classrooms so we can give them orthodox perspectives on the world. We want to inoculate them to the temptations of the world, to give them a bit of spiritual medicine to keep them from destructive behavior. And of course, if you remember Mary Poppins, you'll remember that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And we sometimes use that strategy in our youth ministry and religious education efforts. We rack our brains coming up with strategies to make the church relevant to young people, don't we? Which is interesting because that would suggest that deep down we actually think the church is irrelevant. We create bait and switch strategies to lure kids into our programs with promises of food and fellowship and fun. Anything to get them in the door so we can expose them to the spiritual part of the program, the spiritual medicine we want to give them to protect them from the temptations of the world. And if we stop to think about it, I think we all have to struggle with some of the unstated premises that shape our ministry and educational efforts. Our efforts are too often motivated by a fear of the world rather than a love of the kingdom. They come from a posture of defense, preparing our kids against some feared onslaught, rather than from a posture of offense, preparing our kids to actually live as Christians in the world. Our ministry and educational efforts are shaped by the way we see the church as an ethical or cultural or philosophical system, rather than as the living body of Christ. Youth group and Sunday school are places we send kids so they can learn good behavior or, at best, learn about God rather than actually encountering him and opening their lives to him. To put this as simply as I can, we tend to shape our ministry and educational efforts around information rather than transformation. So we need, first of all, to be honest with ourselves about what we're actually here to do, about what we think the point of youth group and Sunday school and retreats and summer camp actually is. Notice that this webinar is called Connecting Kids to Christ, not to the faith or orthodoxy as abstract ideas or systems, but the person of Christ. And I think if we reflect a little bit, we'll all realize that there are many times during the course of the day when we talk about the faith in the abstract or orthodoxy in the abstract, when we should be talking and connecting with Christ, the person rather than the idea or the institution. And notice that this webinar is not called Teaching Kids About Christ. It's called Connecting Kids with Christ, because our actual task as youth workers and religious educators is deeply existential and visceral. It doesn't simply deal with our heads. It involves our hearts as well. It involves everything about us. So we need to be honest with ourselves and own up to what our project actually is versus what it actually should be. And when we do that, we can then admit that our effort to inoculate our kids against the secular world is actually more secular than we may realize, because they and we live in the secular world and are more shaped by the secular world than we may think. So it's important here to take a few minutes to think about the world and how it shapes us, because this is really an important question we need to consider and address. We've already begun to address some of the assumptions we take for granted about ministry. Now I think we need to better understand the current state of the world and the needs and thoughts of people today, to work through how we can reveal Christ to people today, which is our job, right? Not yesterday, not in 19th century Greece or 15th century Byzantium, today, wherever we happen to be. Which is what the three hierarchs did, for instance, when they preached the gospel to the Hellenistic culture of their day, which is what Saints Cyril and Methodius did when they preached it to the Slavic culture of their day. Where are we? Who are we talking to? So this analysis, this part of the webinar, is going to be informed by a book I highly recommend to all of you. It's called How Not to Be Secular. It's by James K.A. Smith. You can see it on the screen there. It's an analysis of a much longer and more in-depth book called The Secular Age by Charles Taylor, which you can also see on the screen. That book's 900 pages long, and since you may not have time to work through that, at least not yet, start with Smith's analysis. I think that's a good place to start. So Taylor, via Smith, presents us with three stages in the development of that critical little word, secular. We'll quickly work through what that meant in different stages of history, what that means today, and how that can help us understand the needs and struggles and questions of people today, which is something we need to understand if we're going to have any hope of connecting them to Christ himself. So the first stage, or secular one, is the classic sacred-secular divide. It's a quintessentially medieval understanding. Priests and monks are those with a sacred vocation, while butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers are those with a secular vocation. These categories of sacred and secular may have interacted with each other and were far from hostile, but there was a clear division between the two. Despite the separation of spheres, both priests and bakers still had access to the transcendent. So in a secular one framework, angels and demons can be hiding behind any and every corner. Mental illness, for example, was still widely seen as the result of demonic influence. Very different intellectual background than the one we're living in right now. The point is that it was never difficult to imagine that a transcendent reality was near. Some people could and did conceive of a world without God, but despite the distinction between the sacred and the secular, the world itself was not divorced from the transcendent. So following the Enlightenment, people moved beyond simply distinguishing between the sacred and the secular. And in this new era, secular II, people began dividing sacred and secular into separate realms, realms that were in a degree opposed to each other. The secular sphere was the public sphere, intended to be kept areligious, rational, neutral, without the divisiveness of religion. What replaced it in this age of enlightenment was a new, objective, scientific understanding. And we have to keep this in mind. Whenever we're talking about non-religiosity, we're working in a secular II paradigm. Nuns, not nuns, N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S, those with no religious affiliation, those who identify with no organized religion, are working in a secular II paradigm. When we're afraid of our kids growing up to become non-religious nuns, we are working in a secular II paradigm. Moreover, when we talk about secularism, we almost always mean secular II-ism. that there is an increasing distance between the religious and the non-religious spheres of life, and perhaps even a degree of hostility. As the world transitioned from secular 1 to secular 2, the sacred sphere began to shrink. So the narrative of the secular 2 age is dependent upon a subtraction story, that as we remove religion and God from the public sphere and cram it into its proper and shrinking place, what remains is pure rationality. We used to believe in gods and spirits and fairies, but now we know that the sun is just a giant ball of gas and that depression is caused by chemical imbalances, not demons. Many of us in the church tend to think that we are living in a secular 2 world. We see the story of our age as a part of the secular 2 subtraction narrative and believe ourselves to be victims of a secular world that has waged a war on religion by removing prayer from public schools, statues of the 10 Commandments from the front of courthouses or public buildings, as we see in the photo, or crosses from public spaces. We believe this to be evidence of our secular age, but again, we mean secular 2 specifically. We also are afraid that our young people will leave the safe boundaries of the religious world within which we've raised them and be overcome by the perverse culture of secular 2 state schools. We see that they're going into the world to engage with ideologies that are devoid of, if not hostile to, God. So we give them orthodox perspectives or worldviews to counter the secular perspectives they will hear in college and beyond, the spiritual medicine that inoculates them against the secular world. This secular 2 paradigm shapes most of the ministry we offer to youth and young adults, as we discussed earlier. The trouble, Taylor suggests, is that we're no longer in the secular 2 age, even though that's the way we're still approaching ministry for the most part. He says we moved on to what he calls secular 3. While secular 2 may center on the division between belief and unbelief, secular 3 is not defined by this polarity. Of course, there are still poles, both atheist and religious fundamentalists, people like Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists on one side and something like ISIS on the other. But as Taylor points out, most of us inhabit a middle ground, one that is defined by cross-pressure between belief and doubt, between faith and questioning. Most of us are either people who want to believe, yet are tempted by doubt, or people who don't want to believe, yet are tempted by belief. And I think if you go and you read How Not to Be Secular, there are incredible examples of this too. Examples from pop culture, song lyrics and movies and books where you see this really interesting tension between people who are operating in very clearly a non-religious paradigm, yet have this constant longing for God. Like there's this wonderful and haunting opening line from this one novel in particular. And the first words of the novel are, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. That's powerful. In secular 3, the options for belief have changed. We can be Christians or Buddhists or Muslims or Jews or atheist humanists or anything we want. But even more than that, the very conditions of belief have changed. While what we believe may be the same as what people believed, say, 1,000 years ago, how we believe it has largely changed as a result of this cross-pressure between belief and doubt. And I think this is especially difficult for us as Orthodox to deal with, because this is a hook on which we hang our hat so much of the time, that this is the faith of the fathers, this is what we have believed for 2,000 years and beyond. Yes, what we confess today is still what we believed 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, but we don't believe the way that Basil believed. We don't believe the way that Maximus believed. We don't believe the way that Cyril believed, because we're swimming in different cultural, intellectual waters. Thanks to cross-pressure, we experience what Taylor calls the Nova effect, this incredible explosion of possibilities that erupt from the self, the center of all religious experience. Because we are the center of this explosion, this supernova, the most important factor in our lives is choice. To the extent that religious affiliation or political affiliation or most anything in this secular 3 age is important, it is important to the extent that you have chosen it. So, think about this, right? Consent choice is very so often the way we have our dialogues in the world about ethics, about politics, whatever it is. What people believe, what people choose to believe is all that counts at the end of the day. Like the greatest sin of our modern age is intolerance. So Taylor defines our secular three age, in which belief in God is just one choice among many, as an age of authenticity, an age of expressive individualism. As a result, religion becomes primarily a matter of self-expression. It's not about adhering to a particular set of beliefs versus another set of beliefs, in the sense that it's not about determining what is right or true. It's about finding what's right for you. Haven't you heard that before? People talk about my truth or your truth. This is the world we're living in. Except even here, we may be tempted to reduce secular three to mere subjectivism. It's not that only, although it is subjective. In secular three, our current age, the believer is bound to the immanent frame, to the here and now, to the visible and sensible, to the concrete, to the opposite of transcendent, if you will. Immanent transcendent. There is no longer a sense of the transcendent participating in the world, as there was in secular one, or even to some extent in secular two. In secular two, stuff could actually do stuff, so to speak. Things and places participated in the transcendent. Relics and icons could gush myrrh because they participated in the transcendent, to something beyond our understanding. In secular one, no one would ever think about going to see a movie about demonic possession, like Paranormal Activity or something like that, because who knows what you'd be opening yourself to with such an activity. But we go to these movies. We go to these movies because we're safe, because it's not real in the same way, because it's just a movie. There's some disconnect between us and the outside world. As Smith and Taylor say, we're buffered, in a sense. Buffered from the outside world, buffered from any sense of transcendence. There's kind of a wall between us and the culture around us. In secular three, however, all meaning, all spirituality is now squarely located within the self. Only in secular three can cathedrals become museums, ancient locations that were sacralized by people deciding to do spiritual things. Only in secular three can churches become nightclubs, as in the picture on the screen. A former Episcopal church that became a nightclub here in New York City and is now being converted into a gym. In secular three, it's the presence of the people who make it sacred, rather than the place itself being a location for experiencing the transcendent. Religion in our age is merely self-expression, which is why people can worship wherever they would like, which is why people can desecrate religious spaces, because there's nothing inherently holy or sacred about them. We choose to make things holy or commercial or whatever we want. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's the culture, that's the intellectual, philosophical, theological environment, atmosphere in which we live. So that was a quick little overview, but for more on this, I'll suggest a video that we recently made, how to make ministry better and more Christ-centered. It's on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Y2AM. So when we understand our secular three age for what it is, an age of authenticity, we can better understand what our young people, in fact, what all people actually need. We live in this cross pressure, tempted both by the desire to believe that there is meaning and life in the world, and the fear that maybe there is nothing but nothingness after all. People don't need to be inoculated against doubt. We're beyond that. Doubt and struggle is in the air that we breathe. It's in the water that we drink. People aren't in danger of becoming rabid atheists either, though. If they're not attending liturgy, they're either moved on to another congregation or they're searching for some vague spirituality on a surfboard out in the middle of the ocean or on some remote mountaintop. You know, and this is what the data really suggests. Like, if you go and you look at You Lost Me, which is an interesting study by the Barna Group, you'll find that even though people are less religiously affiliated, even though you're seeing this rise of the nuns as people go from their high school years into their young adulthood years, people are dramatically less religiously affiliated, but not less spiritually inclined. There's a really interesting tension between the two. People aren't falling away from the church because they don't believe in something above necessarily. We're caught in the cross pressure. We believe and we don't. There's other reasons that are causing us to fall away from church. They're out there. We are out there, if we're honest, I think, with ourselves, on a journey, a quest for their authentic selves in this age of authenticity. So that was a little bit of a background. Quick, I apologize. We can flesh some things out more in the questions if you'd like. But to make this a little bit more concrete, let's look at Be the Bee in particular and how it's designed to speak to people in our present age, in a secular 3 world. So I want to hit a couple of characteristics about the video series. If you're not familiar with the video series, it's available on our YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/Y2AM. Y2AM stands for Youth and Young Adult Ministries. Y times Y, Y squared, hence the Y2. It's a math joke. Sorry, folks. Actually, not sorry. I'm kind of an unrepentant nerd about that stuff. It's just me being authentic. So first of all, it's personal. It's incredibly personal. It's a regular guy looking you in the eye, talking to you very plainly about complex and important topics. It's not simply that it's a video. I think sometimes people misunderstand what it is about something like Be the Bee that resonates with people. It's not simply that it's a video or that it's multimedia or that it's current in any sort of way. Yeah, multimedia has advantages that textbooks and handouts do not, but there are plenty of videos out there, plenty of church videos out there, which operate in a secular 2 framework rather than in secular 3. Plenty of videos out there that are very informational and have that failure to connect. But Be the Bee isn't simply a more efficient way to download information into the brains of young people. It's an unfolding story. The story of a guy sharing what's deeply interesting and moving to him. So an episode of Be the Bee isn't simply making the point that this or that aspect of Orthodox doctrine is true. Instead, Steve, a real person, me, I'm in the video series, but I'm going to talk about myself in the third person here because it's weird to explicitly talk about myself. Steve is sharing something that is deeply moving and important to him. You can see it in his enthusiasm. You can hear it in his voice. You can see it in his eyes. And that is an advantage of multimedia, but there's more to the story. Because before you as a viewer even get to wondering whether this theology is true, that's not even a question. It's abundantly clear that Steve believes it's true, that it's meaningful to Steve, that it's meaningful to some other human being. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of our makeup in a very deep sort of way, that we are moved by things that are moving to other people. We are drawn to things that draw other people. This is why very often the difference between whether something connects with us or doesn't is not the subject matter as such, but the person who's teaching the subject matter. Like I fell in love with chemistry when I was in high school, not because chemistry is inherently interesting, but because my chemistry teacher loved chemistry, and that enthusiasm was contagious. And in our age of authenticity, this point is so crucial. To be blunt, most people aren't even sure whether truth exists, like we said. They're not looking for something that's true in an objective sense. They're working within this true for me, true for you sort of paradigm. And they're looking for something authentic. And Be the Bee, because it's clear and direct and personal, carries a certain degree of authenticity. Second, it's honest. Not simply in the sense that Steve shares what's important to him, but Steve also shares his doubts and his fears and his struggles. Steve has confessed to being bored in church, to being long overdue for confession, to struggling with doubts, to struggling with repeated sins and temptations. Steve isn't perfect, and he doesn't pretend to be perfect. He's simply a fellow Christian, a co-pilgrim doing his best to walk towards Christ and his kingdom. And that resonates. Third, it's practical. And this is really where we often drop the ball in youth ministry and catechesis. You know, we give kids prayer ropes when they graduate Sunday school, for instance, and we give them absolutely no clue how to use them. We give kids Bibles, these massive and intimidating tomes with zero guidance on how to actually read them. We give kids prayer books full of long and difficult to follow prayers with no insight in where to start. So are we really surprised when prayer ropes become nothing but decorative bracelets on our wrists, or Bibles and prayer ropes gather dust on a shelf? On Be the Bee, we spend a lot of time, especially in recent episodes, digging into practical next steps. You say you're having difficulty praying? Here's something you can do today. You say that you're having difficulty forgiving? Here is something you can do today. If our theology is divorced from some concrete action, if it isn't actually incarnate in our lives, then it's abstract philosophy. It's dead philosophy. It's theory. And I think Be the Bee resonates with people because it demands something of them. You know, in our age of authenticity, activity rather than passivity is so important. You know, this is really ultimately what Smith says we do in this age of authenticity, in this supernova of choices, right? You can be anything that you want to. At some point, we have to choose. And that's really that first step forward. And for those of us who believe, or try to believe anyway, that there is a God and that he is real and that he loves us, and that this is more than just a theory, more than this is just a choice, that at least is our first step in that direction. An active choice to plant my flag and say, I'm going to try to be an Orthodox Christian. I'm going to try to attach my authenticity to this. And over time, that can sink in. You know, that's really the difficulty of ministry, how to reach people, how to give them the truth when they don't believe in truth necessarily. But that's the wonder of truth being a person, not a concept or an idea. Because even if we're not really to believe in abstract, true propositions, I think people are ready and willing to connect to a person, to the person of Christ. And those of us who iconize Christ, right? Who represent Christ, who bring Christ into their lives. Fourth, by virtue of being practical, it's participatory. It's active. Be the Bee isn't simply something you watch. It's something you watch and then act upon. Whether it's a deep action, like building a prayer rule or finding a spiritual father, or a simpler action, like sharing the video on social media, the viewer is invited to be more than simply a viewer, more than a passive recipient of information. The viewer is invited to be a co-laborer, a co-worker, a co-liturgist, if you will, engaged in the saving work of God's people, to whatever extent he's able, to take a step towards choosing Christ. Fifth, Be the Bee is communal, because so many people watch not alone, but with family or friends or their youth group or Sunday school class. And the cool thing is, even if you do watch alone, you're not really alone because you're hearing another person's voice. You're looking another person in the eyes, and you're just a click away from posting a comment and engaging in a discussion or sharing the video with others. Online communities may not be our goal, but they are real. And unfortunately, many people out there are isolated and alone. They feel estranged from their families and their parishes, or maybe they're not close to a parish. Maybe this is the only way that they've actually gotten any connection to the church. They feel cut off and alone for any number of reasons. And if online community is the best we can give them, then at least thank God for that. Though hopefully it's a spur to us to give people more deeply authentic community. I mean, we're the body of Christ, after all. There's nothing more communal than that. So wrapping up, what does this all mean? I'll take a few minutes to maybe set forth some ideas, and then I'll open up for questions. What does this mean for my particular Sunday school classroom, for my particular youth group, for the work I do week in and week out? As I said, here are some principles to keep in mind. First, Jesus Christ is enough. First and foremost, we need to remember that Jesus Christ is enough. Actually, we need to ask ourselves whether we believe this is true. Because when the apostles left Jerusalem and traveled to the ends of the earth, they didn't have money, didn't have food with them, they didn't have safety. They didn't have anything except the Lord. And that was enough. Our ministry and educational efforts don't rest on videos or textbooks or field trips or anything but the crucified and risen Lord, on a person, a real person. Remember, our goal is to reveal Christ in the lives of the kids in our care, not simply to teach kids about Christ, but to introduce them to Christ, to place them in his hands. That can't happen if we don't know the Lord, or at least are trying to know the Lord. After all, we can't share what we don't have. Just think of how any saint of the church would deal with the question of connecting kids with Christ. Their first instinct wouldn't be to find the right book or attend the right seminar. It would be to fast for those kids, to pray for those kids, to lift those kids up and place them into the Lord's hands. You know, when's the last time we poured ash on our head and wore sackcloth? I haven't. I admit I haven't. Maybe there's something wrong with that. Next, be ready for rejection. All that being said, you need to remember that you can do everything right and still end up with a kid that's bored or disconnected or ends up falling away from the church or drifting into this or that terrible sin or mistake. When it comes to people, there are no guarantees. Like I said at the beginning, these are not youth ministry hacks or magic tricks or anything like that. The Lord made Adam and Eve, and both turned their backs on him. The Lord had 12 disciples, all of whom constantly doubted and complained and failed to help people. You know, remember that time when Christ was literally ascending and the scripture says they doubted? Remember that time when Christ sent them out to cast out some demons and they couldn't? One even got him killed. If people turned their backs on Christ, they're going to turn their backs on us. In response, all we can do is love them that much more fervently and try that much harder to lift them up to the Lord. So I'll refer you back to the first point. Jesus is enough. Third, next, authenticity. Remember that people are not necessarily looking for truth because they don't necessarily believe in it. They're looking for authenticity. They're looking for realness. It's an age of authenticity, after all. Contrived tricks and strategies to be hip or relevant don't really work. I'll never forget a conversation I was having with a person who used to lead a weekly Bible study in Texas. She's non-denominational, part of a Bible church, and she hosted this Bible study in her house and got over 100 kids every week. Which I think some of us are like, what? We would love to have 100 kids at our youth programs every week. So as we talked about that, I was surprised to hear that by far the most popular group leader was a sweet old woman. She was far from hip, clueless when it came to pop culture and fashion. She didn't care. She was just herself, a sweet, caring person. And the kids responded to that far more than to the younger group leaders who were trying too hard. You know, we're seeing this actually with some of these non-denominational whatever kinds of churches that are been trying for the last couple of decades to do the laser shows and the hip sort of youth ministry thing. There might have been a temporary spike, but it's all falling away because kids have a certain BS meter in their nose and they understand when things are contrived and inauthentic. Again, that's a consequence of being in this age of authenticity. It's hard, right, to force yourself or to try to shoehorn yourself into something that you're not, to try to play a certain part. But the good news is that we don't have to. God has placed you in particular, in that classroom or in front of that youth group. Not a book, not a set of theological propositions. You, a living, breathing person who can be present with and for those kids. You, not anyone else. For God knows why, but you, he chose you. And authenticity doesn't simply apply to you as the teacher or group leader. The kids in your class need room to be authentic, to find themselves, to express themselves, to choose to take up the cross and follow Christ. Because in this nebulous nova effect, that first step, that first planting our flag, is choice. So if you watch a Be the Bee video, for instance, ask them for their reactions. What did you think? What spoke to you? What will you carry with you? What did you think was lame? They need space to think, to reflect, to wrestle, and to verbalize. If you're reviewing the weekly gospel reading, don't simply ask them to recite what happened. Ask them to reflect on how God is speaking to them through the passage. What resonated with them? Who do they identify with in the reading? So often we turn scripture into a mere text right? Something that is the object of textual analysis rather than an act of revelation, a way to encounter the living God right here, right now. A hook that we can use to draw ourselves into the story of Christ, to identify with some aspect, some miracle, something, to make it alive for us, to make him alive for us. Focusing on authenticity is a way to transition from an information-based model of ministry to a transformation-based model of ministry. And that's the direction we've all got to be going. Community. I think we have to realize that the faith isn't a thing merely to be taught. Christ isn't a subject merely to be studied. Christianity is not a thing we can pick up in the classroom in the way that we can learn chemistry or history. So the classroom model can't really apply, at least not completely. Prayer can't simply be a thing you lecture about. Prayer has to be a thing into which you invite people as a community in communion with God. So don't just talk about prayer, for instance. Make space for your kids to get to know each other and pray for each other. This is both a way to harness that instinct for authenticity, to open up about ways they'd like people to pray for them, and then for us to live as a Christian body by lovingly praying for each other. And it becomes real, and it becomes something we choose to do, not simply a lesson we distractedly sit through as we count down the moments until the bell rings. Don't just talk about the importance of loving your neighbor. Make space for your kids to love and help each other. Make space for your kids to love the people of the parish, maybe by serving during coffee hour, for instance. Make space for your kids to love the people of the wider community, both by gathering supplies for people in need and actually going out to meet people in need. You know, we can talk about this a little bit more, but so often when we think about ministry, this is a consequence of this information-based model. It's very passive, right? It's ministry to kids, youth group, Sunday school, whatever it is. But there's three aspects of that. If we're willing to see this as a more active thing, it's not simply ministry to kids. It's ministry by kids. The ways that they can be active, the ways that they can be co-liturgists, right? In the same way that they can share a video, they can share some of God's grace in the world by doing something, not simply passively receiving. And there's ministry with kids. We are a body, a church. And unfortunately, we over-demographize ourselves into youth and young adults in these little boxes of people. We're one body. Arms and legs, hands and feet, eyes and nose, ears, all together, we're one body. And yes, there are ways for us to think about, ministry to youth in particular, or ministry to young adults in particular, but we can't forget that we are supposed to be together in some way too, as a community. And remember, there is no greater, more perfect community than the kingdom of God, which we experience in the liturgy. So why do we pull kids out of liturgy? Why do we implicitly reinforce the broken notion that Christ is an object of study, better encountered in the classroom than at the chalice? Why do we make Sunday school something that competes with liturgy rather than complements liturgy? I want that to be the last sort of thought for you guys for right now. We're about 45 minutes in. I've said a lot, and there's a lot more that could be said. But I think I want to stop here and open it up for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and head over to the Q&A. Okay, so there's a great question here. How can I relate this authenticity with the youth to encourage them to participate with the St. John Chrysostom Oratorical Festival? And thank you for your prayers. I appreciate that. Remember that second point that we said about Christ was rejected. We're going to be rejected sometimes as well. I'm going to click this to answer live. It's okay. Christ was rejected. We will be rejected. So there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees that our kids are going to participate in the Oratorical Festival or anything else, for that matter. It just is. That just is the way it's going to be. But how can you do it? I think, in my experience, very often the Oratorical Festival or any other sort of assignment that we give kids is like a book report. You go and you research something and you recite something. And there's a distance between the person giving the report or the presentation and the material in particular. I would encourage us to think about the talks that kids give in the Oratorical Festival, not as book reports, right? Which is the way that they're very frequently done, but as sermons. This is an opportunity for a young person to pray, to reflect, to identify something that he or she is passionate about, and to share it with the community. You know, I love it when communities actually invite the participants of the Oratorical Festival, and not simply just the winners, to even offer like a sermon, whether at the end of liturgy or during coffee hour or whatever it might be, a public opportunity to share the gospel. So first of all, reframe the question. It's not simply a book report. It's not simply a research project, right? Get Christ out of here and get him into here. And then give kids a pulpit. Give them an opportunity to express themselves. Like, it's crazy how difficult it is for us to get kids to do the Oratorical Festival or whatever it is, but they create fan art for their favorite music and movies. You know, they create these wonderful long blog posts that they write on Tumblr and, you know, all sorts of other websites that are out there that are reflective and deep and powerful. Because when something comes, like, they just want to be heard. They want to be heard. You know, I think kids especially, because sometimes they feel talked at rather than listened to. So maybe we should reframe the question of what the assignment is in the first place. Don't even make it an assignment. Don't make it a research program. Make it a sermon. Make it an opportunity to share, and then give them the space to share. Question 2. How do you work on changing a stale culture of a more traditional catechism approach with a parish or other youth organization? That's hard. That's hard because a lot of these questions, for them to sort of like be truly implemented, it's not simply like your particular classroom that needs to change. It's like everything that needs to change on some level. I think we try with what we do. Or I should say we try, or we can act with what we have power to act upon. If we have a classroom that we are in charge of, we can make changes in that classroom. Even if the entire Sunday school might have a different approach, we can at least try there. If we are a volunteer at, you know, Goya or Joy or whatever youth group, we can try something there. We don't necessarily need to change the culture of a parish any more than we necessarily need to change the world, right? It's like Saint Seraphim said, like, change your heart, find peace in your heart, and thousands around you will be saved. Christ is the savior of the world. But if we have control over our hands, we have control over our particular responsibility, if we can at least make steps towards that, then maybe that can be the light that others need to see as well. There was one that said, say what secular 3 is in just a couple of sentences. Secular 3 is this cross pressure. Secular 3 is doubt. Secular 3 is us caught in the tension between believing and not believing, basically. And secular 3 is choice. Everything, the only thing that we can do is choose in this world of unlimited answers. That's kind of it in a nutshell. Secular 3 is now. Okay, next question. Let's see. When do you have Sunday school so that they don't compete with liturgy? Children need to be asked to think, observe, hear what they are experiencing in church instead of counting ceiling tiles, falling asleep, fidgeting in the pews. So when do you have classes to set interaction with liturgy into motion? This is a difficult thing again, right? This is a structural thing. What I've seen work in some parishes, though, is for Sunday school to happen after liturgy is done. So like people will go and they will be with their parents at liturgy. After the Andiveron is distributed, parents can go downstairs for coffee hour, develop some communion with each other, right? Develop fellowship with each other, and kids can go to their classroom. Or some parishes even have parents go to some level of adult catechesis while the children are in the child catechesis. So everybody's getting something. Some parishes also do it earlier, like some will do Sunday school during matins, so that the kids are there from the very beginning of liturgy until the very end, and it happens earlier. It's earlier, right? But like, people wake up early to go to work, and people wake up early to go to school. Why don't we ask people to wake up a little bit early to go to liturgy sometimes? I don't know. There's options, in other words, is what I'm saying. And different parishes have tried it in different sort of ways. If we believe the liturgy is important, not simply us having this seminar, right? But like, if we all believe as a parish that liturgy is important, it's got to take priority. Do you think we need to stop seeing ourselves as Sunday school teachers and more as disciple leaders? As Sunday school suggests that my most important ministry is teaching, whereas discipleship would encompass the whole life of the church: liturgy, fellowship, teaching, service, and witness. Yes. Discipleship leader, I think, is a wonderful phrase. Another one that you could even think of using is like mentor, or sibling even, because we're all children of God and we're all family in a very real sense. My coworker and friend, Christian Gonzalez, he has a second video series that we do on our YouTube channel called The Trench that some of you might be familiar with. And yesterday's episode was actually about this question of mentorship and some of the ways that we model faith to other people, right? And guide other people through faith. Love The Trench. All right, cool. Thank God. So that's something maybe to check out. But I think that's wonderful, because it's so much more than up here. We're not simply teaching, right? We're not simply teaching. We're initiating. We're not simply, even looking at it another way, we're not teaching Christians. We're making Christians. We're forming people into the image and likeness of God. Like, that's really our project. And that's heavy and that's intimidating, but that's what we're doing. We're not the equivalent of chemistry or biology. Another, we've been doing Sunday school on Saturday before Vespers for decades, and it's been working for our parish. Kids also have the chance to play and experience fellowship between Sunday school and Vespers, and that's awesome. And that also has the added benefit of showing people that there are other services besides liturgy on Sundays, which is another way that we've failed people. We're supposed to be a worshiping community, and yet very often the only thing that we make available to people is Sunday liturgy. I mean, which is great. Obviously, it's the liturgy, but there's more than that. Please pray for our kids. Thank you very much. Pray for us too. What age is the trench appropriate for? So the trench is kind of like more of a young adult thing. It's not that it's inappropriate. It's just that it deals with like questions of like relationships and like there's an episode on dealing with your boss, and there's going to be episodes on like how you like argue responsibly with your wife, which just might not be interesting for a younger person. So it's not inappropriate. It just might not be, it might not speak to that particular like age. What ages do you consider to be youth? I think on some level, the whole question of youth and young adult is like both helpful and not helpful. In the Archdiocese, youth and young adults means, I think, ages 6 to 35. So like youth technically is 6 to 18 or 17, and then 18 to 35 is young adult. But again, youth is a big basket. A 6-year-old is going to need very different things than a 17-year-old. So in the abstract, sure, it's helpful to think about ministry for youth, but really ultimately, like, ministry is for people. It's looking people in the eye, individual persons in the eye, and loving them, right? And giving them what they need. How do we make the ministry more centered on introducing kids to the person of Christ? This, I think, is a question of tone, right? I think that we don't, I sometimes think that we remove prayer from what we're doing, right? We kind of like very frequently make ministry about like ethics or information about Christ, rather than, as I said before, like living the faith. So we talk to kids a lot about prayer, but we don't actually invite them to pray for each other in particular. We don't offer confession enough with youth ministry and Sunday school. And it's crazy because kids go away to camp and they love having the opportunity to confess. Because confession, if you think about it, is like perfectly tailored towards this age of authenticity. Because an adult priest gets to sit down and listen to you talk. And you get to open up your heart, which is what they want. Like our kids are writing posts and tweeting and Instagramming and all these things. They want to be heard. Confession is a place where they can be heard. Confession is a place where they can be brought back into communion, right? Reconciled with the Lord. Why aren't we doing more of that as part of our ministry efforts? How important is liturgical catechesis in ministry? I think it's important, right? But here's the thing. I'll say this as a challenging question. I think Father Tom Hopko put this at one point. He's like, back in the old days, we didn't need to catechize people liturgically, right? Especially when we're talking about people who were baptized into the faith as infants and grew in the faith, because they experienced it every Sunday. They experienced the liturgy every Sunday, and they experienced matins every Sunday morning, and they experienced Vespers every Saturday evening, as well as feast day services and feast day Vespers and feast day matins and so forth. Matins or supplication services and compline before bed, right? Like when we're actually in a liturgical sort of rhythm and we're living the liturgical cycle of the church, at least more than we are now, doing our drive-by communion and the things that we very frequently do, and we're able to understand the words of the prayer and they can kind of seep into our hearts over time, that's different. When we're encouraging kids to get up there to the chant stand and maybe chant along from a young age, even if they don't have well-developed voices, but they're internalizing the prayers, that makes a difference. When we're asking our kids to read the epistle, that makes a difference. You know, we're sending a message that you are a part of this body. Not one day in the future when you're old enough to be a parish council president, but now. Now, we baptized you as a baby. You got your first communion when you were however many months old. You were as full a member of this church as anyone else is. Come and raise your voice in worship to the Lord. Let's see, we've all sat through dry discussions. How do you help priests and other speakers in engaging, connecting, and conversing with youth and young adults? I think sometimes dry discussions are, we feel, you know, and this whole thing about engaging, connecting, and conversing, I think that as ministers, we need to pray more for the people who are in our care and listen to the people in our care a little bit more. You know, our instinct is always to talk, right? One of my friends who I was at seminary with, who's now become a clergyman, he would always joke that there's nothing more dangerous than a priest and an open microphone, you know, because we feel like there's silence and somebody has to fill the silence with a sermon or whatever it is. But we can listen to people. You know, we can listen to youth and what's going on in their lives. We can get to know people. There doesn't have to be a verbal lesson each and every time. You know, and that's okay. Our silence can be golden. Advice on how to break down the barriers caused by ethnocentricity. That's a difficult thing. That's something that we have to break down individually ourselves, right? Can we open up our homes to other people? Can we become kind of a locus of community? You know, we can't expect other people to change. All we can do is change our own hearts and maybe take that first step to breaking down some of those walls. It's difficult. It's really difficult. But the only heart that we have control over is our own, right? I need to work on myself first, live my faith, and not worry about if anyone is getting anything from my writing or not. But at my same time, to keep writing. Most definitely. I think we just, and that's kind of an interesting thing as well, the artistic sort of aspect of it, or the creative sort of aspect of it. That whether we're writing ourselves or whether we're talking with kids or whether we're leading them on pilgrimages or whatever it is, it's all an offering to the Lord. And, you know, it's kind of like the parable of the sower. All we can do is throw it out there. And it might not always take root, but we keep sowing those seeds. Keep sowing those seeds. What religious education books would you recommend? I definitely recommend that book, How Not to Be Secular. It's not a religious education book as such. It's kind of like a state of the world and the culture book. And And I think that's really, really helpful. Like it's just helped me to articulate so many instincts that I had about what the world is. And before anything else, even I would recommend that book. Well, thank God. Pray for us. Let's see. Oh, textbooks for high school, Sunday school. Not familiar with that, with the sort of like the textbook side of things. I know that the Department of Religious Education is in the process of updating their materials. And I'm not sure exactly where they are at the present time, but that's something that they're hard at work at doing. But like specific sort of classroom materials, I'm not, I just don't have the competency to sort of like recommend particular textbooks as textbooks. You know, people choose to read books sometimes with people, which are helpful. But that's kind of another question, I guess, than an actual textbook. Tips for getting kids enthusiastic about choir. That's a great question. I think like kids want to hear their own voice, right? I mean, like kids want to make noise, I feel like on some level. Kids want to be heard. You know, I mean, I guess I'd need to sort of know a little bit more about what the question is or what the difficulty sort of is. Number one, but number two, like not every kid's going to be enthusiastic about choir because not every kid maybe is meant for that to be their offering, right? I think maybe the question should be, how do we break down some of the barriers that prevent the kids that want to be a part of the choir to be a part of the choir? You know, like I think about myself when I was a kid, there's no way I would have done choir. There's no way. I never served in the altar. I never did any of that stuff. I was a Sunday school student, like through and through. And I started teaching, I think, when I was like a junior in high school. Related, overcoming a parish that does not welcome a choir versus solely chanters. That's a structural thing as well. It is possible for chanters to chant as a choir. You know, choir we sometimes think is like 4-part harmony and whatever it is, which is another question. But even in like the Byzantine style, it doesn't need to be only a single person doing the chanting. You know, hopefully this is just a question of opening participation up. You know, let's see, how can we connect the older generation teacher to these concepts? The Sunday school teacher who has taught for greater than 20 years and are set in their ways at church. Gently in with love. All right, gently in with love. If think about it in your position. If you had been doing something for a long, long time and had a lot invested in this, like this is a part of who you are. This is your offering to the church. This is your offering to the Lord. Like you take pride in it. You're worried that it's going to be a sacrifice that is acceptable to the Lord. It's a hard thing for it to be. It's a hard thing for you to change that necessarily. So I think we need to be sympathetic to that and sensitive to that. That it's not necessarily like pride or stubbornness, right? It's just that like this is what I've been giving the Lord for so many decades, and I want it to be a good and worthwhile thing. You know? So maybe starting with that mentality, being sensitive to the love behind that stubbornness. I hope that makes sense. Let's see. Thanks. God bless you. Tailor lessons for special needs kids like autism. That is totally out of my realm of expertise. And I really, really wish we did more. We had more resources for that. That's something for us as a church to definitely work on. My dog heard the bell. How do we speak to children raised in a secular three-word world about reading the Psalms the way Christ read them, or reading Scripture the way the fathers did? Hey, sorry guys. I think we have to model that. We have to model that, honestly. I think we have to, first of all, this is why it's so helpful, I think, to get kids to read the Scripture in the services, right? When there's an Old Testament reading, when there's an epistle reading, to have kids be a part of that as well. Because if they can have the words of the Lord on their lips, like over time they will sink into their hearts. And I think we don't do that sometimes. We don't do that a lot, actually. We don't see them as like viable readers or viable singers. And that's a way of disenfranchising them. What themes can we look forward to in future Be the Bees? This week we're doing about practical things if you are having trouble forgiving. We're going to be doing things about the different sort of levels of clergy. We're going to talk about all of us as being priests of creation and all of us having this active liturgical role. Oh man, I have the whole thing actually like written out through May. So there's a bunch of them to keep in mind. This week, actually, we're doing one on serving others through the lens of Philoptochos, like doing more doing, the way that Philoptochos president Maria Logos has said. So a bunch. Hopefully we'll be going through every week until June, basically. Okay. Does Be the Bee have any printables available, like handouts or outlines or syllabi? Glad you asked that. To make it a little bit helpful for people, because we know a lot of people are using Be the Bee in the classroom and in whatever. We're actually right now developing model lesson plans. Right now we're kind of limited to just doing Joy, or Goya, I should say. So it's a lesson plan that could be tweaked downward age-wise. We just have limited resources. But we've done the first 25. And I think we're going to start hopefully making those available very soon. How can we refocus our Sunday school and other youth programs towards drawing our youth closer to Christ and away from simply delivering the structured topic lists, and away from the largely social focus of Goya? I think we have to restart by refocusing ourselves, more than anything else. And I think that to the extent that we can begin making structural changes to see this as like more than simply a classroom thing, and to see it also as kind of an integrated thing. Because I also think one of the problems we deal with in the church is that like Sunday school is a thing, and Goya is a thing, and family life is a thing, and camp is a thing, and we have all these different ministries that are separated from each other rather than all working together. Oh man, how would you address teen suicide, drugs and alcohol, and social media, the other drug? Yeah, social media is definitely a distraction. I think a lot of these issues, suicide, drugs, and alcohol, come from a profound sense of loneliness that a lot of people have. They're very frequently cries for help from kids. Like there's reasons, I think, that kids engage in self-destructive behavior because they feel like they're invisible, because they feel like they're not loved. I think all of those are a challenge for us to simply love more deeply and love more authentically, because people know that this is self-destructive behavior. They know that it's self-destructive behavior. Do they know that we love them? Maybe that's the question. How would you present to our senior classes the church's views on present-day social issues? Depends on the issue, I suppose, but I think we always have to approach things positively rather than negatively. As St. Porphyrios always used to say, we draw close to the Lord, we draw close to the light rather than work against darkness. Everything, I think, has to be framed in terms of a love of the Lord first and foremost, and a lack of judgment for other people, because it can be so easy for us, unfortunately, to pick your social question, right, into kind of a thing that alienates people because it comes across as just judgmental and harsh. Love in all things. Like, remember St. Porphyrios in Wounded by Love. He goes to the brothel on the day of Epiphany, and he offers them holy water. No judgment or anything. He just goes in and he prays for them because they're people too. Icebreakers or games that connect to Christ, that is a weakness of mine. I'm terrible at games and I'm terrible at icebreakers. I apologize. What are suggestions for reaching out to baptized, chrismated Orthodox Christians who do not currently go to church and forming a relationship with them? We have to invite them, I think. We have to invite them. This is the whole thing. Christ goes out and he goes to Zacchaeus and he says, Zacchaeus, I'm coming into your house. Personally. Do we know somebody in our family who is disconnected from the church? Can we invite them one Sunday? Can we invite them even to a meal and just pray with them at a meal? It doesn't even necessarily need to be 0 to 60. Get them to liturgy if they're that resistant to it. Maybe there can be a tiny foot in the door. Let's see, I'm having a hard time getting the kids in my class to speak up and answer questions when I ask them. One thing that's helpful, I think, for classrooms is journaling. It's sometimes helpful to give them a piece of paper, or you can even make journals for them and give them a few minutes to write down their answers, because then you can walk around the room and say, oh, you wrote something, if nobody is willing to raise their hand proactively, invite them to share what they've written. Journaling can be a way to really focus the mind, and it can be a way for them to initially open up in kind of a safe place. And then once they've thought through an answer and worked it through on paper, they can share that then verbally. We do that with our B2B retreats, and it's actually kind of a nice first step. Special needs info is available at illumination-learning.com. Thank you, Jennifer. That's right. Let's see. Any books that can help teach girls and boys chants and song prayers used in our services? I mean, there's the green liturgical book, right? But I think people are transitioning away from that. So I can't think of anything besides that. How do we compete with sports? Here's the thing. In terms of fun, we don't. We don't compete with anything because the church is not more fun than anything else. Christ doesn't promise us fun. He doesn't promise us wealth. He doesn't promise us comfort. He promises us life. We're not going to compete with anything else. We don't have to outfun anything else. We outlive anything else. Like, be true to who we are. Be true to who we are. We don't have to compete with anybody. We're the church. We're the kingdom. We don't have to compete with anybody. Just invite them to come and taste and see. Haven't addressed parenting and family issues. Is that encompassed in being ready for rejection? What should we as Sunday school teachers be offering to our families? No, I think that's an important thing, because I mean that's where all of this starts, right? We can all look at the lives of saints, and there isn't a single life of a saint that I've ever seen which starts with, Saint so-and-so was touched by an incredible experience at Goya or Sunday school or whatever it is. No, it's always like Saint so-and-so saw his mother or his father doing prostrations in the middle of the night. That's the thing. That's the thing. Like the little church, the home church is so incredibly important. So incredibly important. And we're actually kind of working on things now with Department of Family Ministries to help unite what happens at the parish, what happens at camp, and ways that it can be reinforced at home. So hopefully parents don't have to do things from scratch, but that they can kind of know what's happening in the youth ministries at the parish and then complement it at home. What are best topics to focus on by age group? So by graduation, they have a good foundation. That's a huge question about sort of a full-on curriculum, which I would not be able to do justice in just a few minutes. That's a huge question. So rather than do it justice, I'm just going to have to apologize. The Teen Survival Guide, still relevant in the Secular 3. Is the Wellspring going to update it as a resource? Still working on exegesis, exogenous commentaries. The Teen Survival Guides, I think to some extent, right? It's something that I think we need to sort of go back and review. The Wellspring needs to be reviewed. We're in the process actually of trying to put together a new website, y2am.org. And unfortunately, we have not worked on any new exogenous commentaries in a long time because of just lack of resources. It's something that I used to do when I took on director duties. I just had that much less time. And I love that because I think it was so helpful for people, but sometimes you just have to make the tough choices. It's on the radar. It's got to come back. Thoughts on allowing non-Orthodox youth or visitors to attend Sunday school? Beautiful, right? Beautiful. Let them come and see too. Our kids, right? Orthodox kids get invited to non-Orthodox Sunday schools and youth groups and stuff all the time. Wouldn't it be amazing if our kids loved what was going on enough that they invited their friends? Wouldn't that be amazing? And that if they got to the church, right, they actually encountered the bosom of Abraham and a warm welcome. That'd be amazing. Not familiar with specific topics of past Be the Bee. Do you have any that address prepping for the secular, i.e. religiously hostile environment? See, I would push back a little bit on that. And I think that a lot of that is kind of a secular 2 sort of mindset. I went to Yale University, which was sort of a very stereotypically liberal place. I didn't really encounter any hostility. There might have been some disrespect to it, but nobody prevented me from going to church on Sunday or anything like that. I think the thing about the faith is that if we're sort of loving to people, we're not really going to get under anybody's skin. That's my experience anyway. Even going at sort of like what have been sometimes called hostile environments, I haven't seen any of that hostility. I think that, I think that that's sometimes a secular 2 sort of mindset rather than a secular 3. Like even a lot of these people who are hostile to the faith are actually like haunted by a God that they wish was there. And if we could better witness to him, that'd be a wonderful thing. And then the last question on this list anyway, because I think we've worked through all of them, candlelight versus floodlight. Oh, come on, candlelight. There's something wonderfully ethereal about that. So we are done with questions in the Q&A, it looks like. Oops, one more. As a student, how can I influence my peers to want to learn like I do in Sunday school? Don't apologize. That's a great question. I think that you just sort of, you do it. Honestly, you influence your peers by being a light to them. It doesn't even have to be forced. It doesn't have to be a strategy, right? Like, bring it up in conversation. Do your cross before a meal. When something wonderful happens, give thanks to the Lord in front of them. When something awful happens, give thanks to the Lord. Your friends will come to know Christ through you. That's really the challenge for all of us. Easier to say than do, I realize. But you don't have to. I think maybe a question is like we sometimes think about an end that we have in mind with our interactions with people. Like, how do I get them to this particular end? Like, sometimes we just have to love. Sometimes we just have to love. Christ just loved us, even to the point of us killing him, and he forgave us for it. That's unconditional love. That's no strings attached love. That's hardcore. That's really hardcore. Okay, so that is the end of the Q&A. It looks like the Q&A channel is closed. We are an hour and a half into this. So I'll just leave you guys with our email address. If you ever need to email me or the office, feel free to email us at y2am@goarch, GOARCH.org. Thank you very much for everybody. I apologize if I steered anybody wrong, but hopefully we'll pray for each other and we'll figure this out together. We're crawling towards the kingdom, and that's kind of the best we can do. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your patience with me. God bless you guys.